Thank you for tuning in to this installment of the Movie Geeks United Anniversary Series. On this episode, we celebrate the 35th anniversary of the hit film Gremlins. The guest is director Joe Dante. This interview was conducted in 2009 by Arenado Diaz and our sibling podcast, Back by Midnight.
Also opening on the same day as Ghostbusters was another iconic summer of '84 movie, basically actually an iconic film of the whole year. That's Joe Dante's Gremlins, kind of a It's a Wonderful Life meets Invasion of the Body Snatchers, crossed with just a little bit of Alien. And Joe Dante, just a terrific deconstructionist of genre filmmaker who had previously done genre exercises in Piranha and The Howling, but finally got something with a little bigger budget, but also got the support of Steven Spielberg, who gave him his blessing by producing Gremlins, and what turned out to be kind of a polarizing film, and also a key film in creating the PG-13 rating. We talk about all of this, and also in another pre-recorded interview. So here is my interview with filmmaker Joe Dante.
Well, I probably was one of those kids whose first movie was a Disney movie, because I had some aunts who used to take me to the movies, and I'm sure that around that period it was either Snow White or Peter Pan. But the movies that really sort of resonated with me were the ones that I went to by myself at Saturday matinees in a theater that was only a few blocks from my house. And it was quite a ritual. It was on Saturday there would be 2 features and 10 cartoons. First boy and first girl in line get in free, so you would start lining up quite early. It was only a quarter to get in, and once you were in, you spent maybe half the movie looking for change on the floor so you could buy popcorn or candy. And during that period, the early 50s, they used to run a lot of older pictures, a lot of Tarzans, a lot of Westerns and stuff, but they also were running a lot of science fiction films. And I do remember It Came from Outer Space made a tremendous impression on me, partly because it was in 3D, but also because it was bigger and more spectacular than any of the other movies that I was seeing.
Mm-hmm. And if I have it correctly, your parents were kind of athletes. They were golfers. Am I correct?
Well, my mother was not. My father was a golf pro, and he was a teaching pro. He had the choice to either go on the golfing circuit, which is kind of dangerous to do when you have a family, or to just sort of take a teaching job. And so he moved from country club to country club, and we would move with him.
And so, but you didn't go into athletics. You went into more.
No, to my father's probable everlasting disappointment, I did not become a golfer because I really wasn't that good at it. And when you're the son of the pro, you want to look like you're pretty good. It's a sort of an advertising gimmick. And so my interests were not in the sports area.
So you were into to drawing and art. You went to the Philadelphia College of Art.
Right. I think one of the reasons that I pursued the drawing so strongly was because I had polio for a year when I was about 7, and I missed 3rd grade. So I spent most of my time in bed drawing. And I created comic strips, I created little stories and continuing characters, and the whole thing. I was sort of doing movie scripts even then.
And so at that time, was it the goal to be a filmmaker or to be an animator? Or?
No, the goal of filmmaking was far, far away because the kids at that age think that the movies just happen. They don't even think they're written or directed. They think the actors make up the lines, and you don't get too sophisticated about that until you're maybe 7 or 8 or 9. But I never. It was one day I went to a movie and I counted the shots in the movie and I got lost after like 150, and I thought, well, this is impossible. This is not a job I could ever do. It's too hard. So I was going to be a cartoonist. That's one of the reasons I went to the College of Art.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing I want to talk about real quickly, just because I always find it fascinating when filmmakers or screenwriters were film critics first before going into filmmaking. And after you got out of college, you were a film critic. Am I correct?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the word critic. I was a film reviewer. I
Right.
worked for a magazine called Film Bulletin, which is a trade magazine, which was ostensibly written for exhibitors. And I took it upon myself to try to do reviews for the record of all the obscure movies that opened that nobody ever reviewed. All the foreign imports and strange, low-budget horror films and exploitation pictures that nobody ever really wrote about seriously. And I was a series of them were reprinted in a magazine called Video Watchdog, and of course I had to reread them, and I was shocked at how hard I was on the movies that I reviewed. And now, looking back from the viewpoint of a filmmaker and realizing how difficult it is to make any movie, let alone a good one, if I had to write those reviews today, I'm sure I would have written them much differently.
Do you read reviews of your films?
You try not to, but you always end up reading them. And I've been kind of lucky because generally I've been pretty well treated by critics. Although every so often I'll have a picture that gets such terrible reviews that you do sort of wonder, well, what was I thinking? But then the odd thing about reviews is that they're so of the moment, and when we look back at some of the movies that we all love the most, and you look at the reviews, they really weren't all that enthusiastic. The way a movie impacts its own time isn't necessarily a measure of how good the movie will be in a number of years after that.
Right.
So some of the pictures that I made a picture called The Burbs with Tom Hanks, which got terrible reviews. I mean, there was one good review. All the rest of them were bad. And oddly enough, it's become this sort of cult favorite, and people have websites devoted to it, and they quote the dialogue, and they play the characters. And one guy did a homage on the internet where he just took his next door neighbor and his father or whatever and went out and shot a couple of scenes from the movie with the same script. So you never really know. I mean, you can't really go by reviews because they're really only the thought of the moment, and sometimes movies have a life beyond that.
Mm-hmm. And just as a postscript, do you have any opinion one way or the other of the kind of flourishing of not only online criticism but online kind of what they quote unquote movie geek websites, and how that kind of
Well, it's all gone online, hasn't it? I mean, you look at all the major newspapers, and they're either folding or they've gotten rid of their critics, and that goes for book critics and film critics, and that kind of introspection doesn't seem to be very popular right now. And part of it is due to the fact that over the years, so many spoilers have been written in reviews that people feel that they don't want to read a review before they see the movie because it's going to spoil it for them. And then after they see the movie, they've already seen it, so they don't feel the need to read the review. And the internet has really become the repository for people who want to revisit a movie and talk about its inner meanings or talk about it in detail. And it used to be that was the province of the film magazines, American Film and Take One, and many. When I was just got into the business in the early 70s, there were many film magazines like that. And now there's Sight and Sound in England, and there's Film Comment here, and that's about it. And they all tend to be rather highfalutin, and they don't really give that much attention to the average picture.
Right. Well, so in the 70s, I believe a friend of yours from college was working for Roger Corman, New World Pictures, and suggested you move out there to work for Roger Corman. And what was
I had just gotten married, and my mother was dying, and it was one of those upheaval moments where my father said, your mother would want you to go out and try to take advantage of this opportunity. So I did come out here, and that was in 1974. And a year later, I was directing a movie. Now, that's not, I don't think, something that probably could happen these days. But then Roger was making films for drive-ins. There was a tremendous market, not just his company, but others, where they were making a lot of low-budget, non-union films to fill up the drive-ins. And it was a terrific time to be able to get into the movie business on a sort of the under level. And then every so often there would be an opening in the unions if you had done enough pictures or done enough films as an editor or whatever. Then you could be brought into the union. and it would open up maybe once a year or something like that, and you could eventually take advantage of that. But those ways are all gone now. None of that exists anymore. You can't come out to Hollywood and expect that you'll be directing a movie in a year.
Yeah. And going through that Roger Corman School of Filmmaking for about 4 or 5 years that you were part of that, what did you learn from that you have taken that has translated into what your studio films and beyond?
Well, at Corman's, the budgets were so low that they virtually dared you to make a film, and so you had to learn a number of tricks to be able to get the work done on time, and those were tricks that you don't forget. And when you end up on a big studio film where the pressures are the same, there's just more time involved. I find that I often will go back to techniques that I learned from Roger about setting up a scene and trying to reduce the number of reverses to do and relights and a way to use the track so that you don't have to lay it twice. And all these little sort of economy tricks that you pick up are very useful. And if you notice, a lot of people who went through the Corman School have ended up with creditable careers because they are able to make films on time and to be efficient because they know how to do it.
Right. And I guess now we should probably get to Gremlins. Gremlins came at a time you had you'd gone through the Corman School, and then you had directed a couple of films that were hits, Piranha and The Howling. And so how did and then you did your segment for Twilight Zone, segment 3. And so how did Gremlins come to you?
Well, after I did The Howling, I didn't work for quite a while because the company went out of business. And I was developing another film for them called Meltdown, and they suddenly went belly up, and nobody got paid, and it was a fairly bleak time. I was contemplating borrowing money from my father, which is something that you just don't want to do after you've made a couple of movies. And in the mail comes this script from Steven Spielberg for Gremlins, and it turns out that he had seen Piranha and The Howling, and he wanted to make a low-budget horror film in Oregon at the Osmond Studios, non-union, and I started talking to him about doing that. And during the discussions of that picture, the Twilight Zone movie came up, so I, started work on the Twilight Zone movie while developing Gremlins. And eventually, in order to make the film, Spielberg needed to go to Warner Brothers to get some more money because it was obviously not going to be able to be done quite as cheaply as had been hoped. And it ended up as a studio picture. And I was, very lucky to have been there. And it was a movie that was made for $11 million, which was quite cheap at the time for that kind of film. And it was a surprise hit. Certainly no one expected it to be a big hit. And it sort of put me on the map. I got my picture in Time magazine.
Well, let's talk about when you read that. Spielberg sent you that script, so I guess he thought that something about that script would match up with your sensibilities.
I don't know if it was necessarily a question of sensibilities or a question of my ability to make a cheap film. He had seen Piranha earlier, and Universal, which Piranha was a ripoff of Jaws that I made for Corman, and we did it around the time that Jaws 2 was going to come out, and Universal was not amused that this cheap rubber fish movie was going to come out to compete with their rather expensive sequel, and so they considered enjoining the film and trying to keep it from being released, and so they apparently showed it to Steven Spielberg, who said, "You guys don't get it. This is a parody. This isn't like a ripoff. Although it was a ripoff." And he managed to get them to cease and desist, which meant that looking back on it, if he hadn't intervened, that movie might not have come out, and I might not have had a career. So he was familiar with me in that sense.
Right. Well, and so you read the Gremlins script, and from what I understand, Columbus's original script was darker and more horror oriented.
Well, it was Chris wrote the script as a writing sample. It was not considered something that would probably get produced, and so he just threw it in the kitchen sink. And when Spielberg read it, he he liked it and wanted to make a movie out of it, but it was more of a horror movie. I mean, it was the Gremlins cut the mom's head off and bounced it down the stairs, and they ate the dog, and they did some very, very grim things, although there was an element of fun to it. So while we were making it, we realized once we saw the Gremlins and put them in human clothes and had them walking around and doing these things, that the movie was obviously going to be much more entertaining if we sort of made more of that. And so as the picture was in production, it started to become more of a comedy. Mm-hmm. And when Spielberg saw the picture finished, I remember I was sitting a couple of rows behind him in the theater, and he was like putting his forehead to his head, sort of like, oh no, what has he done? And it's kind of an interesting thing because it was a movie that nobody really got. The studio didn't really understand it until we ran it for an audience. And mm-hmm. at the time, the practice at Spielberg's place was to finish the movie before you ran it for an audience. You didn't run a rough cut. You didn't run a print with splices and scratches and temporary music. You just finished the movie. And then if they wanted to make changes, they would make them then. So we managed to finish the entire picture, and so we had a screening in San Diego, I think, and the reaction was the kind of reaction that every director is lucky to have once in his career, at least, where the audience was literally on the ceiling, and it was completely unexpected, and they thought it was hilarious and great, and they gave it terrific scores, and all of a sudden, Warner Brothers figured, well, gosh, somehow we have a hit on our hands that we didn't expect. I guess we better crank up that merchandising.
Steven Spielberg presents Gremlins. Billy Pelser has a nice home.
Billy, is that you?
Yeah, Ma, it's me.
A nice job. A nice girl.
If you're not doing anything this Thursday night, maybe you'd like to go out on a date with me?
I'd love to.
And loving parents who are about to give him...
You're going to like this. No, don't shake it. We're going to have to open it now. It won't wait till Christmas.
The most unusual gift he ever got.
What is it? No.
It's your new pet.
Come on, Bonnie, be a good dog. My dad gave it to me.
But there are a few things to keep in mind. If you expose it to the light, you may hurt it. If you get it wet, it will multiply.
All that from water? They got wet?
Yeah, plain water.
And most important, no matter how much they beg, never let them eat after midnight. Because when they do, they change.
How many permutations did the Mogwais and then the Gremlins go through to get to that final design?
Well, the actual Gremlin design is pretty much like a picture that Chris Columbus wrote and put into the script. He actually had a drawing, a gargoyle-like creature that was quite similar to the final Gremlin. But the other Gremlin, Gizmo, the cute one, went through a number of permutations. At one point, he even looked like Peter Ustinov. I remember he was just a sort of roly-poly, hairy bear. I mean, he looked kind of like an Ewok. Before there were Ewoks, I guess. Or maybe was it before they were Ewoks? I can't remember. Anyway, Stephen kept turning down the designs, and we were getting close to, the point of no return where we were going to have to start producing these things. And so we got the idea of making the Mogwai the same color as Stephen's Cocker Spaniel. And when we did that, suddenly he approved the design. And so we were able to go ahead and make them.
What was the most logistically arduous sequence to do in Gremlins?
Well, anything involving the puppets was arduous. The movie was shot in two sections. It was shot in the section with the actors and as minimal puppetry as we could get away with, and then there was another shoot a couple of months after we wrapped of just Gremlins doing stuff, and that was like almost a month of just Gremlins. The sets were all built up on stilts so that the Gremlin puppeteers could be under the sets, and they had monitors with the pictures flipped as if you're looking in a mirror. And the entire thing was, there was this little city underneath all the sets, and it made it very hot, very unpleasant. and there were wires everywhere, and to try to keep them out. And this was before CGI, when you could take wires out. This is like everything we photographed is what you see, and anything that we didn't want to have you see, we had to frame out somehow. And it was very time-consuming and arduous. So it was probably the hardest movie I ever did, because we were inventing the technology. I mean, it's really a sort of a giant Muppet movie, but the techniques that we were using were all brand new and had never really been tried before on that kind of scale. So it was, particularly the bar scene. I was shot. It took a long, long time to shoot the bar scene because we had so many gags in it.
And when you're shooting a scene like the bar scene or the theater scene, and it's days on end, after a certain point, does kind of a sadism kind of set in amongst the crew on, like, let's just, where any kind of affinity for
since there was never any light at the end of the tunnel, the crew would take out their frustrations on Gizmo, because he was the hardest gremlin to manipulate, because he was the smallest, and all those gears and wires and stuff had to be stuffed into his head, and then he had to not look like a bag of bolts when he was finished. And there was a lot of time waiting on him because he would break down, and then I remember once the production manager walked in and everybody was asleep because the guys underneath the floors were, they had their flashlights out and they were trying to fix Gizmo, and the whole rest of the crew had gone to sleep. What basically happened is we started running out of ideas for gags, and so we would put up a little note that would say to the crew, ideas for ways to be mean to Gizmo. And they would all write down what we could do to Gizmo, and it was like a little torture sheet. And then we would shoot various things off of that list, including tying him to a dartboard and throwing darts at him and throwing him down the laundry chute, things like that.
Well, and I guess I gotta ask, start wrapping this up, about the infamous kitchen sequence, which maybe you can kind of explain, because I mean, whether it's true or not, basically, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins are cited as the two films that basically instigated the PG-13 rating.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when the kitchen sequence came up with the microwave and the blender and so forth, at the time, was there a thought that maybe this is a little, am I going to get in trouble for this, or what was the process of that?
No, we thought of it as a fantasy, so it wasn't something that we figured we were going to get in trouble for. There was a question of how gory do you make it, how gooey do you make it, and the microwave scene obviously was a highlight of the movie to a lot of people. But even to get that by, we had to make some cuts in the scene. When Mom stabs one of the gremlins with a knife, we made a gremlin lying on the kitchen counter with his hands on the knife trying to pull it out, and blood coming out, and they made us cut that. And there were a couple of other cuts that we made when the teacher gets killed in the science lab. Our original version, we tracked in on his. He wasn't in the release version. He's lying under a desk, and there's one hypodermic in his rump. But in the version that we shot, we see his entire face, and there's maybe 20 hypodermics sticking into his face, and that disappeared rather early in the game. They got to look at that in the dailies, and they said, "We can't do this. We're getting into R-rated territory now." So yes, it did. The two pictures together did cause the creation of the PG-13, and a lot of parents complained that because the movie was advertised with a poster that was the same colors as E.T., and it looked kind of like E.T. 2. It had a furry little hand coming out of a box, and people thought, oh, it's a cute, cuddly movie. And, of course, it wasn't a cute, cuddly movie. And so parents did complain, but I never heard a kid complain. And, Walt Disney didn't exactly go broke by scaring kids. It is a part of childhood, conquering those kind of fears. And I think it particularly now in the haze of the distance of 25 years, it really is a good kids movie. But not probably for kids under, 9 or 8. I think it's a little too scary for them.
And did parents complain more about the kitchen sequence or Phoebe Cates' monologue?
Well, parents didn't complain about them. Well, some did, I guess. But if you're taking a child that young to a movie like this, I don't know that you. If I mean, I don't know what age kids stop believing in Santa Claus, but it's usually not much past 8 or 9. And anybody who was taking a kid younger than that, I think it did say PG, parental guidance. You know, it means you're supposed to go there with your kid.
Mm-hmm. And I'll ask about the Jerry Goldsmith score, which is one of his most iconic scores. And
yet, when I first heard him play it on the piano, because in those days when you went to the composer's house, he didn't play it on synthesizers; he played it on the piano. And when I first heard it, it sounded like circus music to me. Mm-hmm. And I really was kind of like, Jerry, are you sure that this is what you really want to do? And of course, it was brilliant, and I was a dummy. But I really did in those days have a difficulty in translating piano music into symphonic scores in my head. I eventually got better at it. But I inherited Jerry on the Twilight Zone. When I came on, he had already been hired. Mm-hmm. And we got along so well that I asked him to do Gremlins, and it led to a 10 or 11 film collaboration.
Yeah. Well, and start to wrap this up, I mean, when the movie comes out, it was a huge success. I remember that weekend I went to actually I think a midnight show with my parents. I was only like 5 years old.
Oh.
And
how the
yeah. Well, and I of course I loved it. And so
what did you think about Santa Claus?
Well, here's the odd thing. I remember as a kid that sequence we used to fast forward just because it was all talking. And it was that at the time it was that obligatory talking interlude in between the quote unquote the good stuff. So we would just fast forward that sequence. So no offense. I hope that doesn't.
No. Once you make the movie, you can't control what's done with it.
Right. And so what was that like? I mean, that wave of success. I mean, you'd had success before with the earlier films. But
not on that scale. I mean, this was a huge success. This is the kind of success that you can either turn into a real jerk or not. And I was in film festivals in Europe. I mean, all these places I really didn't frequent. And it was very nice. The only mistake I made was that everybody was sending me scripts. Everybody was trying to get me to do things after this picture. Oh, who is this guy? We never heard of him. Let's offer him stuff. And one of the things I didn't do was Batman, which I was importuned to do after Ivan Reitman had left the project. And I woke up when I was working on it, and I had a kind of cast and everything, and I woke up and I realized one morning I just didn't believe in Batman. I didn't believe in Bruce Wayne. I didn't believe in the double life in the house on the hill with Robin. I just didn't believe it. I believed in the Joker. I liked the Joker. I understood the Joker. I didn't understand Batman. So I went in and I told them I wasn't going to do it, and they looked at me like I had escaped from a mental institution. I mean, it was like, are you kidding? You're not going to do it? Why? Are you crazy? So I was crazy because not only did I not do that, I signed on to do a picture called Explorers from a script that wasn't finished for a company that eventually changed ownership in the middle of the movie and decided to release it unfinished. Mm-hmm. So that was like a big dumb move for me.
Right. And now it's 25 years later. It's still an enduring film. A Blu-ray is going to come out later in the year, I believe, and had a sequel, which was Irreverent, which was kind of one of these first postmodern sequels that actually extended up the original. Even and I'll have one question about the sequel that is probably one of my favorite gags is what was the process of getting Leonard Maltin to be in it, knowing that he didn't like the first one?
Well, that's why Leonard was in it. I mean, Leonard was a friend of mine. I'd known him since long before I came out to California. And he didn't like the first movie, and he said so. And it's in his book for all to see, 2 stars. And I said, well, Leonard, I tell you what, I'm making this sort of crazy sequel, and how would you like to come on and pan the movie again? And he said, why would I want to do that? I said, so the Gremlins can kill you. And he thought that sounded funny. And so he came in and did it. And it was a very funny scene. And
in this era of reimaginings and reboots, Has Gremlins come up in conversations? Do you know of?
Well, I know that there have been attempts to resuscitate it as in the same manner that they tried to resuscitate it for the Gremlins 2, which was they hired a lot of writers and they came up with a lot of concepts and they wrote a bunch of scripts and none of them really worked, and they eventually had to come back to me because they realized that whatever it was about the movie that was working they didn't get. And in this case, now that it's 25 years from the first picture, there's no doubt about it that it's going to be revisited because a title that's that popular can't not be remade. But my guess is that it would certainly be a remake rather than a sequel, and it certainly wouldn't include any of the same characters. Or it could be a prequel, which seems to be the current thinking about these things. You go back and tell how it happened, and maybe you could take the Dick Miller character and you could, do his World War II experiences with the Gremlins on the airplane or something. But whatever they do is going to be, it's going to be difficult because our movies were defined by the fact that the techniques that we used were puppetry, and what the Gremlins could do and couldn't do was based on the reality of what could be achieved and what couldn't be achieved. Now with CGI, the entire movie could be CGI, and there's no rules. So if the Gremlins can do anything and go anywhere and be anything, then it makes it very difficult to sort of narrow down a plot. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I'm convinced that within the next couple of years they'll certainly be revisiting this.
And I'll just ask, whether, and not without divulging, that either A, have they come to you, and B, if they haven't, do you have in the back of your head an idea if they do come to you?
I could say no to that because I spent almost my entire time doing Gremlins 2 trying to fix it so there wouldn't be a Gremlins 3. And, I've succeeded so far. But I think that the marketplace forces are just too much. I think it's almost derelict duty to the stockholders to not, revisit this thing and try to squeeze some more money out of it.
Well, I'll just throw in my 2 cents. The World War II Dick Miller prequel, I must admit I kind of like that. But that's
I read it on a website, so it wasn't my original idea.